Hello, here I am again in the name of the sovereign creator of heaven and earth, the Lord Jesus Christ. I'm continuing with my exposition of my translation of Matthew's Gospel. We are still in chapter 13. This is the chapter of the parables. We come now to wheat and tares. That's verses 24 through 30, which I will now read. He put another parable to them, saying, "The kingdom of the heavens is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while the people were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went away. But when the stalk sprouted and produced fruit, then the tares also appeared. So the servants of the owner came and said to him, 'Sir, was it not good seed that you sowed in your field? How then does it have tares?' He said to them, 'An enemy did it.' The servant said to him, 'So, do you want us to go and gather them up?' But he said, 'No, lest gathering up the tares you also uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at the time of the harvest I will say to the reapers, first gather the tares and bind them into bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn.'" For the moment, beginning at verse 36, Jesus is going to explain this parable, so I'm not going to try to explain it to you. Since Jesus did, we'll get there in a minute. First, though, I do want to comment what we have here in verse 26. Most of us are not familiar with tares, that is the actual plant, but it looks very much like a wheat plant until the fruit appears, or the grain, or the head of wheat. But of course, the head of the tare is rather different. At that point, you can tell between them very clearly. That was the difficulty. Like the Lord Jesus said, "By their fruits you shall know them." It's only then that you can tell. All right. Like I said, we're going to get the explanation here in a minute. So now I'll just go ahead and read a bit about the mustard seed, verses 31 and 32. He put another parable to them, saying, "The kingdom of the heavens is like a mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, which indeed is smaller than all the seeds. But when it is grown, it is greater than all the vegetables and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and rest in its branches." I need to comment two things here. When it says here in verse 32, smaller than all the seeds, that is, of course, the seeds that are normally planted in gardens and at that time and in that area. The Lord was not making a generic global botanical statement, just seeds you would normally plant in a garden. Then the mustard seed, of course, is very small. We know that the orchid seed is a bit smaller and tobacco seed is a bit smaller, but at that time, people weren't planting those things in their fields, and of those that planted, the mustard was the small. But it would grow into a very sizable plant. In fact, big enough you could almost call it a tree, and birds could actually come and rest in its branches. I have to explain now my translation here. It says here, "The birds of the air come and rest in its branches." I'll explain to you why I did that. The verb that I render rest is a compound form. The noun root refers to a temporary shelter like a tent or a hut. The verbal form means to make use of such a shelter. Here, the preposition kata is prefixed to the verb, emphasizing, as I suppose, the temporariness. In the parallel passage in Mark chapter 4, verse 32, The text says that the birds can use the shade, not the branches. But of course, shade moves with the sun and with the wind. And how can you build a nest in something that keeps moving around? The text actually says under its shade. I have a little article, a short article about that in the appendix called the Yeast of Seeds. I won't read that. You can go there if you want. That I just wanted to explain to you why I put rest instead of making a nest. Now we come to the yeast, verses 33. Well, 33, but I'll read 33 through 35. He spoke another parable to them. The kingdom of the heavens is like yeast, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal until all was leavened. All these things Jesus spoke to the crowds in parables, and without a parable he did not speak to them, so that what was spoken through the prophet should be fulfilled, namely, I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter things kept secret from the foundation of the world. Just a couple of quick things here. 3 measures, that would probably be about a bushel. Quite a bit of dough, a bushel of it. Just exactly, you can find commentators arguing over what the yeast is, whether it's a positive thing or a negative thing, was talking about positive growth of the kingdom or negative growth of bad things in the kingdom. I have no answer for that. The Lord didn't say it, and so I'm not going to say it. The final statement about the prophet, that comes from Psalm 72, verse 2, and Psalm 72 was written by a Levite by the name of Asaph. So Matthew is calling Asaph a prophet. Okay, let's go on now to the wheat and tares, where the Lord is going to explain. This is interesting. I'll read verses 36 through 43. Then Jesus dismissed the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples approached him, saying, explain to us the parable of the tares of the field. So he answered and said to them, he who sows the good seed is the Son of the Man. The field is the world. As for the good seed, these are the sons of the kingdom, while the tares are the sons of the malignant one. The enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Therefore, just as the tares are gathered and burned with fire, so it will be at the end of this age. The Son of the Man will send out his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom everything that causes to stumble, and those who perpetrate lawlessness, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. That was the Lord's explanation of that parable. He's quite thorough. He is the one who's sowing the seed, and the enemy is Satan. And the seed is people. What Jesus sows are his servants, and what Satan sows are his servants. Well, he didn't go into the point about leaving him until the end, but I suppose that has to allow for possible, I suppose, that some of Satan's servants could be converted and change their classification. And there could be some who were following Jesus who would turn their backs on him and change their classification. In any case, the Lord is very clear that the reaping only happens at the end of this age, at the beginning of the Messianic kingdom. Because verse 41, he says quite very plainly, collect out of his kingdom everything that causes to stumble, or those who perpetrate lawlessness. Well, that's not going to happen in heaven, obviously. In heaven, there's not going to be anything like that. So that has to happen down here, and it happens during the Messianic kingdom. And since what he's talking about here are people, so the tares, the bad people, they will be thrown into the furnace of fire. And this is clearly the lake of fire. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That expression is used several places. The Lord uses that word. He's clearly talking about the second death, the lake of fire and brimstone. Here he calls it the furnace of fire. All right, I guess that's it. The Lord is going to send out his angels. The angels are going to be busy. Maybe they're busy already, only we don't see them at work. I think I have a guardian angel or two. I probably keep them busy. If you have one, you probably keep them busy as well. Now we come to treasure and pearl, and they seem to be saying basically the same thing. I will read verses 44 through 46. Again, the kingdom of the heavens is like a treasure hidden in the field, which a man found and rehid, and in his joy he goes and sells everything he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of the heavens is like a man, a merchant, seeking beautiful pearls, who upon finding one very valuable pearl, went and sold everything he had and bought it. Now, just by the way, this is not a big deal, but if you're checking my translation against some other translation, verse 44, the treasure hidden in a field, not the field. Your Bible may say the field, but this is not a specific field. This is a field. 70% of the Greek manuscripts actually do have the article the. I follow the best line of transmission, which is with the 30%. To me, my mind is obviously correct at this point. But whether the treasure or the pearl, obviously, this is, I think, talking about the Lord Jesus Christ and belonging to him, finding salvation in him. It's like the Apostle Paul said in Philippians chapter 3, verses 7 through 9. You go and check that again. He says, count everything but loss for the excellency of knowing Jesus and so on, the resurrection. Remember that? Go back and check it. Several verses there. I take it that is the point. And Paul said he had given up everything. He had lost everything for Jesus. And that's exactly the point of these two parables, I take it. If you want Jesus, you give up whatever's on the other side. Now we come to another parable, a saying. I'll read, it just occupies 47 through 50, but I will read down through 52, which will bring us to the end of the parables. Again, the kingdom of the heavens is like a seine that was cast into the sea and gathered of every kind, which when it was full, they pulled upon the shore, and sitting down, they collected the good into vessels, but threw out the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come forth and will separate the malignant out from among the righteous, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Jesus says to them, did you understand all these things? They say to him, yes, Lord. So he said to them, therefore, every scribe who has been discipled into the kingdom of the heavens is like a man, a householder who brings out of his reservoir things new and old. Well, the bit about the seine, if you've ever done any fishing or observed it, you can understand this. I did this once when I was a teenager. This is a seine is a long net, and you take it out and you move it around, and then you drag it in. And of course, you get all sorts of stuff there. That's what this is talking about. Here again, he's talking about people, good people and bad people, and what happens to them. The bad ones, I get get thrown into the furnace of fire. No, I get a kick out of these disciples. He said, "Do you understand anything?" "Yes, Lord." Yeah. But you see, earlier on, they were asking Jesus to explain the parables. And Jesus said the whole point of the parables is for people not to understand them unless he explained them. I get a kick out of that. Maybe they did and maybe they didn't. Now, however, let's look at verse 52. A scribe was instructed in the law. That is, at that time, what Jesus would call a scribe was, if you like, a doctor of the law. He was be instructed in the law. And he would therefore also be instructed in the prevailing interpretations of that law. That would be the old. But this particular scribe has also been discipled into Christ's kingdom. He has become born from above, regenerated. He now has a new nature along with the old one. But he has been discipled into the new doctrine. His thinking would be reoriented. It would happen like to Saul of Tarsus, really reoriented. So now he's got stuff that's new. He still has stuff that's old, but he also has stuff that's new. And I take it as the point of the scribe here that the Lord refers to in verse 52. Going on now, we leave the parables behind. We now have a visit to Nazareth. This occupies verses 53 through 58, which will bring us to the end of chapter 13. Let me just say at the outset that this is a second visit to Nazareth. The first one is in Luke 4:28 through 30. That's when they took him out to the precipice, wanted to throw him down and kill him. At that time, he didn't have much of a following. Now, this time, he's got 12 disciples. So he has a real guard. No one's going to throw him off or try to throw him off a precipice this time around. Just for you to know, this is the second time, all right? The first time is in Luke. It's not in Matthew. Okay, now I'll read 53. Now it happened, when Jesus had finished these parables, that he departed from there. And coming into his hometown, he began to teach them in their synagogue, so that they were astonished and said, "Where did this man get this wisdom and the mighty works? Is this not the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary, and his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Jude? And his sisters, are they not all with us? Where then did this man get all these things?" So they were offended at him. But Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and in his own house." And he did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief. Okay. Notice, no, this is, they'd already heard him and rejected him. Now they're hearing him again. But of course, he grew up there. They knew him since he was a boy and so on. And it's very hard to really respect someone that you knew as a boy. Anyway, but they knew who he was. They knew the carpenter's son. His mother is Mary. They knew his family, the mother, Mary, all right. And here we have 4 of his brothers. These are his half-brothers with Mary. Their father was Joseph. Jesus' father was the Holy Spirit. James, Joseph, Simon, and Jude. Now, the first and the last one wrote a letter that is in our canon, James and Jude. It's the first and beginning and end of the 7 general epistles. 4 of them. Then he says, his sisters, are they not all with us? Now, the word all really suggests that there were more than 2. You know, there had to be at least 2, okay, but probably if you use all, there are more than 2 sisters. So Joseph and Mary had a normal family at that time, like they had at that time. At least 6, probably 7, maybe even more. We don't know how many girls there were. They just didn't want to understand where Jesus got all these things. And he said, oh, when was a prophet ever in his own town? And because of their unbelief, he just couldn't do very much there. They would probably have heard of his really astonishing miracles in Capernaum and other places, but he wasn't doing them there because they just didn't want to know. Now we come to chapter 14, and now we have the death of John the Baptizer. 14, I'll read 1 through 12. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the report about Jesus and said to his servants, "This is John the Baptizer. He has been raised from the dead, and therefore the powers are at work in him." For Herod had laid hold of John and bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. For John would say to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." And although he wanted to kill him, he feared the crowd, because they counted him as a prophet. But while Herod's birthday was being celebrated, the daughter of Herodias danced before them as she pleased Herod. So he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. So she, having been prompted by her mother, she says, "Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptizer." And the king was sorry. Nevertheless, because of the oaths and those who were reclining at the table with him, he commanded it to be given. So he sent and had John beheaded in prison. And his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. Then his disciples came forward and took the body and buried it, and they went and told Jesus. For the moment, Herodias started out as Philip's wife. Philip was Herod's brother. And of course, in those days, those marriages were not based on love. They were based on political factors, economic factors. Evidently, Herodias had a teenage daughter by Philip. She was old enough to dance and dance in such a way that she pleased the men. The Greek tense here about John telling Herod, it means he did it more than once. He kept right after him. He says, "What you're doing is wrong. What you're doing is wrong. What you're doing is wrong." And of course, no king likes to hear that. Not to mention Herodias. She was really furious. I figured that probably Herodias decided that Herod offered more than Philip, and so she did what was necessary to bring about what happened. That's my supposition. In any case, of course, what does the king do? He puts the uncomfortable prophet in jail. I guess at the beginning he wanted to kill him. He was angry too, but he was afraid of the crowd, and he had to think about the crowd because, after all, he was a puppet king. He was under the Roman Empire, the Roman Caesar. This is Herod's birthday, and you better believe that he had already celebrated quite a bit before the banquet. So he was already not thinking clearly at the banquet. That's how come he did what he did. Yeah, really stupid. But anyway, and the king was sorry, but he had actually sworn up to half his kingdom. Well, what is he going to? Have you ever thought about that? If you were one of the people there at that banquet, and so here comes someone with a bloody head on a platter, what would that do to your appetite? Have you ever thought about that? Probably that sort of ruined the banquet. I don't know. I wasn't there, but I imagine. We are never told what happened to the head. His disciple buried the body, but there was no head on the body. So what in the world Herodias did with the head, we don't know. We've never been told. At the resurrection, John will get his head back. If he's already been resurrected, he already has his head. I want to read now an article that's in my appendix. It's called Herod and John, and if you have my New Testament, it's the third edition. It's number 31 in the appendix. And I do this because we seem to have a discrepancy when we compare what is here with what is in the parallel passage in Mark. That's why I'm going to bother you with this particular bit. So I'm now reading the article, Herod and John. To begin, Matthew 14, 1 and 2, 6 and so on are really about Jesus, not John. I will talk about them. That leaves Matthew 14, 3 through 12, Mark 6, 17 to 29 for consideration. However, strictly speaking, Matthew 14, 6 through 12 and Mark 6, 21 to 29 are really about Herodias, how she got revenge. Well, I will start with the remaining verses, namely Matthew 14, 3 through 5 and Mark 6, 17 through 20. This is where the seeming discrepancy arrives. Well, Matthew 14, 3, for Herod had laid hold of John and bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. For John would say to him, it is not lawful for you to have her. And although he wanted to kill him, he feared the crowd because they counted him as a prophet. Okay, that's Matthew. Now let's see what John says. John 6, 17. You see, Herod himself had ordered John arrested and bound him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because he had married her. John had kept saying to Herod, it isn't lawful for you to have your brother's wife. So Herodias nursed a grudge against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not because Herod feared John and protected him. Knowing him to be a just and holy man and consulting him, he would do many things. Indeed, he would hear him with pleasure. Okay, if you compare those two accounts, it doesn't seem to quite add up. So now we're going to talk about that. Point 1, the whole episode revolves around Herodias. Her marriage to Philip recently had nothing to do with passionate love, as such marriages seldom had. With the passage of time, she had a teenage daughter. She decided that Herod had more to offer than did his brother and managed to convince Herod to take her on. Okay, that's the background. Enter John the Baptizer. He evidently was on speaking terms with Herod and had access to him to the extent that he was able to reprimand him repeatedly for what he had done. Now, kings generally do not enjoy being reprimanded, and a queen such as Herodias even less. Herod was mad, but Herodias was furious. The evident solution was to get rid of the irritant, so Herod had John arrested with a view to executing him. But Herod was a puppet king under the dominion of Rome, and some attention needed to be given to public opinion. It was public opinion that put off the execution. He feared the crowd because they counted him as a prophet. Point 4. Now Herod knew that John was, quote, a just and holy man, unquote, and the two had been on talking terms. With the passing of time, Herod calmed down and cooled off. He decided that he did not want to kill John, but because of Herodias, he could not release him either. She kept on insisting that John should be killed. But, if you must keep a prophet of God in your prison, well, you may as well make use of him. Point 5. Now consider the last half of Mark 6:20. And consulting him, he would do many things. Indeed, he would hear him with pleasure. Now then, attention. I here follow the best line of transmission, albeit representing only 20% of the Greek manuscripts at this point, that has consulting in the present tense. The 80% followed by all versions have the verb in the past tense. Thus, the New King James Version has, when he heard him, he did many things. However, and unfortunately at this point, most modern versions garble the account. Now, the immediately following, he would do many things, or he did many things, is attested by over 99% of the Greek manuscripts. A mere handful, that's 0.4%, less than half a percent of the objectively, they are of objectively inferior quality, have, quote, he was greatly disturbed or very perplexed, as in most modern versions. But then, why did Herod hear John with pleasure? And why was he very sorry? Verse 26. Those modern versions don't make sense. And just why do they insist on garbling the account on such a totally inadequate basis? But what sorts of things would Herod take to John for his opinion? I suggest that Herod used John as a sounding board for administrative problems. And since he often followed his advice, he had an unusually good administration there for a while. That is why he was genuinely sorry to lose John. That's my interpretation, but anyway. However, alas, Herodias knew how to nurse a grudge, and she never gave up looking for a way to kill John. And we know the rest of the story. Just by the way, I don't know if you've ever thought about it. You may, of course, we might say, well, how could God allow his servant to suffer such an ignominious death? But you know, if you're going to be killed, the best way to get it is have your head cut off. It's instantaneous, you don't suffer. It's not like if you're burned at the stake, man, you suffer, okay, before you finally die. Or if you are crucified, dear me, that was hours of suffering. No. If you want to be killed, you want to be beheaded. Bang, all over. So even though the bit about Herodias and all that is just sort of sick, but if you got to die that way, you might as well be beheaded. That way you don't suffer. Okay. Just by the way, we have no right to understand everything, and therefore we don't have any obligation to explain everything. If you want to understand, when you get to heaven, you can ask God directly if you still want to know. Okay, I wanted to read what I said, because if you compared Matthew and Mark, you would say, hey, just a minute. Okay, let's go back down to Matthew. Verse 12, you remember, John's disciples came and told Jesus what had happened. Okay, that's the background. Now I'll read verses 13 through 21. Upon hearing it, Jesus departed from there by boat to a deserted place, privately. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. So when Jesus disembarked, he saw a large crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Now with evening coming on, his disciples approached him, saying, the place is uninhabited, and the hour is already late. Dismiss the crowds, that they may go into the villages and buy themselves food. But Jesus said to them, they do not need to go away. You give them to eat. But they say to him, we have nothing here except 5 loaves and 2 fish. So he said, bring them here to me. Then he commanded the crowds to recline on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed, and breaking the loaves, he gave to the disciples, and the disciples to the crowds. So they all ate and were filled. And they took up the fragments that remained, 12 baskets full. Now those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Now, in a bit, I want to read another article from the thing. But first, I just want to show you this thing. You may have seen this before, but verse 13 here says that they followed him on foot. You have to understand, they went from Capernaum down here to just above Tiberias. So this is a huge bay, but it is a bay, so they could follow him on foot. They could do that, and they did. It's like a modern marathon. They'd be all stretched up, but the faster runners would get here ahead of the boat, especially if they had to row. didn't have a good tailwind. You have to understand, they went along the shore. That's what happened. Okay, I'll get back to that some more, but let's see what else we have here. Verse 13, Jesus wanted to get away, to assimilate it, whatever. Mark says that Jesus and his disciples were under heavy pressure from the crowds. Didn't even have time to eat. So when Jesus hears about he wants to get away, maybe to grieve, but to assimilate to those, and just so they went to a deserted place just up from Tiberias, thinking they were going to have a solitary picnic. I guess, but no. Sorry about this. The crowd followed him along the shore. Followed them. They could see that the boat was full of the whole bit there, all 12 of 13 of them. So when the boat lands, some people are there already, and the others keep coming, like in a marathon. And of course, the Lord, like always, he had compassion on them and healed them. Well, if you think about it, here are all these people running along the shore. And people along the way, they say, hey, what's going on? Where are you going? And so the news spread, and people were sick and so on. They said, oh, hey, here's our chance. Let's go. So the crowd kept coming. As a matter of fact, there were 5,000 men without women and children. By the time you add the women and children, you probably have at least 10,000. Who knows, maybe 15. There's a lot of people. Evening. What are you going to do with 15,000 or 4, even 10,000, or even 5,000, but say 10,000? What are you going to do with it? Evening. So the disciples, hey, send them away. Come on. They wanted to get rid of this problem. Have you ever wondered about what the Lord said to them? He said, you give them to eat. Come on, are you kidding me? With what? Oh, yeah. The 5 loaves and 2 fish, and those weren't theirs. They belonged to a boy there. They didn't have anything. How are they going to feed 10,000 people? Jesus, you feed them. Oh, yeah? Well, obviously, they would have to perform a miracle like Jesus himself did. But of course, they weren't used to that. And if I'd been there, I would have failed the test too. Now, I have an article about this in the appendix. You feed them. I won't read. It's quite long. But if you want more on that, you can go to the appendix and read it. It says you feed them. But I'll talk about this a bit more in a minute. Okay, 5 loaves of fish. Well, but even this was a cop out. Have you ever thought about this? This is say 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Even if they went, Tiberias was a town there, but even if there were some bread stores in there, how many bread stores are going to have bread at 5 o'clock in the afternoon? They make bread early morning, and that's when people come to buy the bread, is in the morning. There's no way that anyone would have enough bread to feed 5,000 men. And even if they went to the farms around, thinking, oh, come on, this is altogether too many people. So it was a cop-out. The disciples just wanted to get rid of the problem. And the Lord throws it right in their face. Yeah. Brings the blessed and breaks and so on. He gave the disciples, I don't know if you thought about that. When the Lord Jesus broke the bread and the fish, they did not multiply immediately into a huge mountain. Have you thought how much bread and fish would take to feed all those people? It says they were full. They weren't just kidded. They were full. That much bread and fish, if Jesus had multiplied it immediately, it would have buried him and the disciples and whoever was nearest. No. When Jesus did, and he gave it to his disciples, each disciple just had some bread and fish in their hands. That's all there was. Have you ever thought about that? Imagine you were one of those disciples, and you have to handle about 1,000 people. Okay, there were 12,000, and there were 12 disciples. So maybe 12,000. You have 1,000 people for each disciple. What I want you to do, I want you to see or feel the faith that the disciples had to exercise. How are you going to take that first step to go in the direction of the people with all come on. Wouldn't you feel just a little bit ridiculous? But they did it. And then here, have some. It didn't diminish. I think that the people passed that around. Otherwise, they wouldn't have. How could you wind up with 12 baskets full of the pieces? And besides, how could just 12 guys get around to all that many thousands of people? I think that the people then started passing it on and just multiplied as it went. We have a world to reach, and Jesus is still saying, you feed them. And we say, with what? Doesn't depend upon our empty hands. It depends on Jesus' full hands. Well, like I say, I'm not gonna read that article. You can go there and get it if you want. Not just 5,000 men, besides the women and children. Now then, let's join Peter walking on the water. Very interesting little bit here, verses 22 through 33. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And having dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. So when night came, he was alone there. But the boat was already in the middle of the sea, being harassed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. So in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they became agitated, saying, "It's a ghost." And they cried out for fear, but immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Courage, it is I, don't be afraid." So, reacting, Peter said, "Lord, since it's you, command me to come to you on the water." So he said, "Come." And stepping down from the boat, Peter walked on the water to go to Jesus. But seeing the strong wind, he became afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him and says to him, "You little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Then those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Now, notice please what it says here. They didn't start this until evening, all right? The sun was going down when they started with the feeding. So it's almost dark by the time everyone has had what they've gathered up the 12 baskets of fragments. But Jesus sends the disciples with a boat, just the one boat, to go across the sea, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he dismissed the crowd, then he goes up on the mountain to pray. He was there alone. Finally, he gets to be alone for a little bit and he spends the time praying. But notice what it says here now. The fourth watch of the night, that would be 3 o'clock in the morning. The disciples had been rowing for 9 hours. The wind was contrary. It was a big boat. It wasn't just a little rowboat. And Jesus knew what he was doing. He sent them there on purpose. They were in the middle of the sea. You have to understand this. As a matter of fact, see if we can manage this again. Okay, they are here near Tiberias, okay, and they went across to Bethsaida. We have to get that from John. But the middle of the sea, this is about 8 miles across there. So in the middle, you're right here. That's where you are. Right in the middle. That's what it says. And they'd taken 9 hours to get there. Peter. Good old Peter. You know, he could swim. You remember after the resurrection, the breakfast on the beach? They're 100 yards up from the shore, and Peter jumps into the water and swims to the shore. He could swim, but this was a storm, waves. I'm a good swimmer, but I can tell you that swimming in a lake is a whole lot different than swimming in the ocean where you have waves. If you have to swim with waves, it's a whole different business. And with the wind, he just got scared and started to sink. And the Lord, but he did walk, he did take a few steps on water, something that I haven't done yet. Now then, I'm going to take time here to read you an article from my appendix. It's number 8 if you have the third edition. It's a page and a half. I think we can get it done this video. I want you to understand what happened here. Actually, it's Luke versus John, but this is talking about the same thing. The question is, just where did the feeding of the 5,000 men take place? Matthew 14:13 and Mark 6:32 merely say that it was a deserted spot without identification. I told you it was Tiberias, but that's from John. Luke 9 verse 10 says it was in a deserted place belonging to a town named Bethsaida. I have to read here a footnote. Lamentably, the eclectic text currently in vogue, following a mere 0.5% of the Greek manuscripts, and that made up of objectively inferior manuscripts, they read to a town named Bethsaida. This is an obvious perversity because 2 verses later, the same text has them in a deserted place. So the editors of the text make Luke contradict himself as well as contradicting the others. That's just by the way. But John 6:23 informs us that the spot was near the town of Tiberias. Well, now, Tiberias, located on the west side of the sea, a mile or two above the place where the Jordan River leaves the sea. Bethsaida was at the top of the sea, a little to the east of the Jordan. I've already showed you that, and as you can see it again. We may deduce from Mark 6:31 and John 6:17 and 24 that Jesus and disciples started out from Capernaum, where Jesus had his base of operations. It happens that Capernaum, like Bethsaida, was situated at the top of the sea, a little to the west of the entrance from the Jordan. Now then, to go from Capernaum to Bethsaida by boat, one would not get far from the shore. You're just going along the shore. But John 6:1 says Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee. That agrees, of course, better with Tiberias, since there's a large bay between Capernaum and Tiberias. I've already showed you that map. Although they're both on the west side of the sea, they crossed close to 10 miles of water. Further, after the feast, Matthew 14:22 says they went by boat to the other side. And verse 24 has them in the middle of the sea. Mark 6:45 says they went by boat to the other side, to Bethsaida. And verse 47 has them in the middle of the sea. And John 6:17 says that they started across the sea toward Capernaum. Verse 19, that they had rowed some 3 or 4 miles. Well, now, to stay close to the shore is one thing. To go over the sea is another. Further, if they were already in or near Bethsaida, how could they cross the sea in order to get there? Mark 6:45. It becomes clear that the miracle, in fact, took place near Tiberias, as John affirms. But that raises another difficulty. How could a property near Tiberias belong to Bethsaida? Luke 9:10. Either it had been deeded to the town somehow, or more likely, in my opinion, it belonged to a family that lived in Bethsaida. My reason for saying this is based on the text. Jesus had permission to use it for private purposes. John 6:17 says that they started toward Capernaum, while Mark 6:45 says that they went to Bethsaida. Well, since the two towns were a short distance apart at the beginning of the crossing, the direction would be virtually the same. I understand that they did indeed go to Bethsaida, but spent very little time there, going from there directly to Natsareth. Indeed, the day after the miracle, Jesus was already back in Capernaum, John 6:24 and 25. But just why then did they make that side trip to Bethsaida? By the way, Gennesaret lies just south of Capernaum, on the beach, on the shore. I imagine the following. A property near Tiberias, but belonging to someone in Bethsaida, would likely be deserted. A great place for a picnic. I suppose that Jesus had permission to use the place when he wanted to get away. But no one had foreseen a crowd of perhaps 15,000 people, 5,000 men, plus women and children. Please pardon the unpleasant consideration, but what effect would a crowd that size have on the hygiene and appearance of the place? You want a lot of bushes. I conclude that Jesus felt obliged to give a report to the owner in Bethsaida. That's how come they were. But they didn't. They just went there, please. So then they went across to Gennesaret. Just while we're here, allow me to call attention to another miracle Jesus performed that you will not find in the usual list. It's already noted, Matthew 14:24 and Mark 6:46 say they were in the middle of the sea. John 6:19 is more precise, saying they had gone perhaps 4 miles. It happens that the crossing from Tiberias to Bethsaida would involve about 8 miles. Now attention please to John 6:21. Then they wanted to receive him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going, end quote. If the total distance was 8 miles, and they had already managed half of it, or they'd only managed half of it, then Jesus transported the boat 4 miles instantly. No, that was a fair-sized miracle, okay? To transport a boat 4 miles in an instant. You won't find that in the normal list, but you read the text and you will see it. Okay, I wanted to get that done before we go on to the next bit. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. God bless.